Have you ever thought about why the most radical thinkers throughout history kept their ideas hidden for years before revealing them? Why does the person who openly challenges group norms get destroyed while the person who conforms outwardly but thinks independently thrives? Why is visible nonconformity punished while invisible nonconformity creates power? This video will change how you see conformity, independence, and the invisible strategy that allows you to think freely while surviving in societies that demand obedience. Today we're diving into Law 38 from the 48 Laws of Power: think as you like but behave like others. But this isn't just about hiding your true beliefs or pretending to conform. This is about understanding one of the most sophisticated strategies for maintaining intellectual freedom while navigating social systems that punish deviation. That visible conformity creates the safety necessary for intellectual independence. That outward obedience is what allows inward rebellion. Let me tell you a story that will reveal everything. In the early 1600s, a man named Galileo Galilei was revolutionizing astronomy through his telescopic observations. He discovered that Jupiter had moons, that Venus had phases, that the Sun had spots. All of this evidence supported the Copernican model where Earth orbited the Sun rather than the universe revolving around Earth. This contradicted Catholic Church doctrine, which placed Earth at the center of creation. Galileo faced a choice. He could publicly declare his findings and directly challenge church authority. Or he could present his discoveries carefully, maintaining outward deference to church doctrine while allowing his evidence to speak for itself. Initially, he chose the second path. He published carefully, framed his findings diplomatically, maintained respectful relationships with church authorities. His conformity in manner allowed his radical ideas to circulate without triggering institutional destruction. But as his fame grew, Galileo became less careful. He wrote a book that made the church's position look foolish. He appeared to mock the Pope through a character representing the geocentric view. He stopped maintaining the outward conformity that had protected him. The church, which might have tolerated his ideas if presented respectfully, felt disrespected and challenged. In 1633, Galileo was tried by the Inquisition, forced to recant his life's work, and spend his final years under house arrest. The tragedy wasn't that Galileo had radical ideas. Many thinkers had radical ideas. The tragedy was that he stopped behaving like others expected. He broke the social contract of respectful conformity. His visible nonconformity, his open challenge to authority, his apparent disrespect for institutions, these made him a target. Not because his ideas were dangerous, but because his behavior was threatening. He thought differently, which was forgivable, but he behaved differently, which was intolerable. Compare this to René Descartes, Galileo's contemporary who was developing philosophy that was equally radical and potentially threatening to church doctrine. Descartes watched what happened to Galileo and learned the lesson perfectly. He developed revolutionary ideas about doubt, reason, and the nature of reality. But he published carefully, framed his philosophy diplomatically, maintained outward Catholic orthodoxy, never directly challenged institutions. He thought as radically as Galileo but behaved much more carefully. He died peacefully, his ideas spread widely, and he became the father of modern philosophy. The difference wasn't the radicalism of their thinking. Both were revolutionary thinkers. The difference was their understanding of Law 38. Descartes understood that you can think anything you want as long as you behave in socially acceptable ways. Galileo forgot this and paid the price. The lesson is clear: societies tolerate thinking they disagree with far more than they tolerate behavior that threatens social norms. Now let me take you back 100,000 years to understand why humans are wired to punish visible nonconformity so harshly. Our ancestors lived in small groups where survival depended on cooperation and coordination. Anyone who visibly refused to follow group norms, who openly challenged group beliefs, who behaved differently from others, represented a threat to group cohesion. These visible nonconformists were expelled or killed because group survival required enforced conformity. But what people actually believed was harder to police. You can see behavior but you can't see thoughts. As long as someone behaved according to group norms, performed the rituals, followed the rules, said the right things, the group couldn't easily detect if they privately held different beliefs. So groups evolved to punish visible nonconformity harshly while tolerating invisible heterodoxy as long as it didn't manifest in threatening behavior. This created evolutionary pressure for a specific cognitive pattern, the ability to maintain public conformity while harboring private dissent. The individuals who could think independently while behaving conventionally survived better than pure conformists who couldn't innovate or pure nonconformists who got expelled. Your brain today contains this evolved capacity for cognitive dualism, maintaining different beliefs in public and private contexts. This is why Law 38 is so powerful. It's not about being dishonest or hypocritical in the negative sense. It's about understanding that human groups have always operated with this division between behavior and belief, between public performance and private thought. The sophisticated operator maintains this division consciously, conforming outwardly while thinking independently inwardly, which allows them to survive and thrive within systems they might fundamentally disagree with. Fast forward to Renaissance Florence, and we see this principle deployed with extraordinary sophistication. The city was dominated by the Medici family, who maintained the fiction of republican government while actually controlling everything. Everyone knew this. But successful Florentines maintained the outward forms of republican participation while privately acknowledging Medici dominance. Niccolò Machiavelli perfectly understood this dynamic. He thought deeply about power, writing ideas that challenged every conventional moral teaching about leadership and governance. But he never openly challenged the Medicis or openly advocated for pure republican government during their dominance. He maintained outward conformity to the power structure, worked within it, behaved as expected. Only after being exiled did he write The Prince, and even then he framed it as advice rather than revolution. The Florentines who survived and prospered were those who understood Law 38 perfectly. They might privately despise Medici rule. They might secretly plan for different political structures. They might think revolutionary thoughts about power and governance. But they behaved conventionally, participated in civic rituals, showed appropriate deference, maintained social norms. Their outward conformity purchased the freedom to think whatever they wanted privately. The ones who failed were those who let their thinking show in their behavior. Who openly expressed contempt for the Medicis. Who visibly refused to participate in civic ceremonies. Who behaved in ways that challenged the social order. These people were destroyed not for what they thought but for how they behaved. The visible nonconformity was the crime, not the heterodox thinking that motivated it. Now let me show you how this operates in modern corporate environments, because offices are perfect laboratories for watching Law 38 in action. Every organization has a culture, explicit values, and implicit norms. The employees who thrive are not necessarily those who genuinely believe in the culture. They're those who behave in accordance with it regardless of their private thoughts. Think about corporate values statements. Most employees recognize them as partially or largely meaningless. But successful employees maintain outward conformity to these values. They use the right language in meetings. They participate enthusiastically in company rituals. They signal alignment with corporate priorities. Their behavior conforms perfectly even if their thinking is cynical or skeptical. The employees who struggle are those who let their skepticism show. Who roll their eyes at company slogans. Who skip optional company events. Who question priorities in meetings. Who behave in ways that signal they're not true believers. Their visible nonconformity marks them as cultural threats regardless of their actual job performance. They might be more competent than the conformists, but their behavior makes them unpromotable or even fireable. This creates a paradox that many people never understand. The way to maintain intellectual independence in corporate environments is through behavioral conformity. The person who participates enthusiastically in all company rituals, who speaks the corporate language fluently, who signals perfect cultural alignment, that person has purchased the freedom to think whatever they want privately. Their conformity creates a protective shield that allows private heterodoxy. But the person who insists on behavioral authenticity, who refuses to participate in rituals they find meaningless, who won't speak corporate language they find hollow, that person loses all freedom. They're marked as a cultural threat and managed out. Their insistence on behavioral honesty destroyed their ability to maintain intellectual independence. They failed to understand that behavioral conformity is what purchases intellectual freedom. You see this pattern constantly. The executive who privately thinks the company strategy is flawed but publicly champions it enthusiastically maintains their position and gradually steers things differently. The executive who openly questions the strategy gets removed. The employee who privately plans to leave but maintains perfect cultural participation until departure gets good references and maintains relationships. The employee who mentally checks out and lets it show when behavior burns bridges and damages their career. Understanding Law 38 means accepting that behavior is what organizations monitor and punish, not thoughts. You can think the strategy is stupid, the values are hollow, the leadership is incompetent. As long as your behavior remains perfectly conforming, your thinking remains private and protected. But the moment your thinking manifests in nonconforming behavior, you become a target. Now here's where this gets really dark, and I need you to pay close attention because this is the twist that changes everything. Law 38 creates societies where everyone is performing conformity while privately harboring all kinds of heterodox beliefs. This means that many of the apparent believers around you are actually private skeptics who have mastered behavioral conformity. The true believers and the sophisticated performers are indistinguishable by external observation. Think about what this means for social movements, political systems, or cultural shifts. They appear stable because everyone is behaving conventionally. But beneath the surface of behavioral conformity, massive amounts of heterodox thinking might be accumulating. When the system finally shifts, when conformity pressure lessens, all that hidden dissent suddenly becomes visible. What looked like stable consensus was actually performed conformity masking widespread private dissent. This is how apparently stable regimes collapse suddenly. How cultural norms that seemed eternal evaporate rapidly. How organizations that appeared unified fragment immediately. The behavioral conformity masked the intellectual diversity. Everyone was performing belief while privately harboring doubt. When the performance became less necessary, the reality became visible. This suggests that you should never trust surface appearances of consensus or conformity. Much of the apparent agreement you see is performance by people who have mastered Law 38. They're thinking all kinds of things while behaving conventionally. The behavioral uniformity tells you almost nothing about actual belief uniformity. It also suggests that when you perform conformity while thinking independently, you're participating in a social system where most sophisticates are doing the same thing. You're not being uniquely deceptive. You're participating in the standard operating procedure of complex societies. The naive people are the true believers who actually internalize what they're performing and the authentic nonconformists who refuse to perform at all. Both groups understand less about how social systems actually work than you do. Let me show you how Law 38 operates in political contexts, because this is where the principle becomes most visible and most dangerous. Every political system, from democracy to dictatorship, requires some level of public conformity to dominant narratives. The successful political actors are those who maintain that conformity while privately pursuing their actual agendas. Think about how politicians operate. They must publicly support party positions, speak party language, participate in party rituals. But the successful politicians are thinking strategically about their own interests, calculating moves based on power dynamics, making deals that serve their advancement. They're thinking independently while behaving as party loyalists. This duality is what makes them effective. The politicians who fail are usually those who insist on behavioral authenticity, who publicly break with party positions, who refuse to participate in rituals they find hollow, who let their independent thinking show in nonconforming behavior. They might be more principled, more honest, more authentic. But they're also less effective and shorter-lived politically because their visible nonconformity makes them targets. You see this in every political system. In democracies, politicians who openly defy party norms get marginalized or primaried. In authoritarian systems, officials who visibly question the regime get purged. The successful operators in both systems are those who maintain perfect outward conformity while privately thinking whatever serves their interests. Their behavioral loyalty purchases the space for strategic thinking. This creates interesting dynamics around political courage. The politician who dramatically defies their party on principle might seem heroic. But they've also ended their effectiveness. They can no longer work within the system because their visible nonconformity has marked them as an outsider. The politician who maintains party loyalty while gradually shifting positions and building coalitions might seem less heroic but is actually more effective at creating change. This suggests that real political skill involves knowing when conformity serves change and when nonconformity is necessary. Most of the time, behavioral conformity while thinking independently is what allows you to build power and shift systems. But occasionally, strategic nonconformity is necessary to catalyze movements or signal shifts. The art is knowing which moment is which and never confusing authentic nonconformity with strategic nonconformity. Now let me take you into how Law 38 operates in creative and intellectual fields, because there's a version of this law that applies to innovation and original thinking. The innovators who succeed are usually those who frame their innovations as extensions of existing traditions rather than breaks from them. They think radically but present conventionally. They behave like they're part of the tradition while actually revolutionizing it. Think about how scientific revolutions actually happen. The scientist doesn't announce they're overthrowing the paradigm. They present their work as solving puzzles within the existing framework. They use conventional language and methods. They behave like good members of the scientific community. Meanwhile, their actual thinking is revolutionary. But the behavioral conformity to scientific norms is what allows their revolutionary ideas to be heard rather than rejected immediately. The same applies to artists and writers. The ones who succeed usually frame their innovations as working within traditions even while they're actually breaking them. They behave like conventional members of their artistic community. They participate in appropriate institutions. They use some traditional forms and references. This behavioral conformity creates enough familiarity that audiences can engage with their innovations rather than rejecting them as incomprehensible. The innovators who fail are often those who insist on total nonconformity, who openly reject all tradition, who refuse to engage with institutions, who behave like outsiders. Their behavioral nonconformity prevents their ideas from getting serious consideration. They might be thinking just as originally as the successful innovators, but their refusal to behave conventionally marks them as cranks rather than visionaries. This reveals something important about innovation. It's not just about having original ideas. It's about presenting those ideas in ways that allow them to be taken seriously. This usually requires behavioral conformity to the norms of your field even while your thinking is challenging those norms. The conformity is strategic, creating the credibility necessary for your nonconformity to be considered rather than dismissed. Let me show you the specific techniques for mastering Law 38, because this is a learnable skill rather than just natural diplomacy or deception. Understanding these techniques transforms how you navigate any environment that demands conformity. First technique, learn the rituals perfectly. Every group has rituals, behaviors that signal membership and commitment. Master these rituals. Perform them with apparent sincerity. Never skip them or perform them half-heartedly. Your perfect ritual performance is what establishes your conformity credentials and purchases freedom for your private thinking. Second technique, speak the language fluently. Every group has its language, its terminology, its way of framing things. Learn this language and use it naturally. Don't just comply with it grudgingly. Speak it as though it's your native tongue. Your linguistic fluency signals cultural alignment regardless of what you actually think. Third technique, show visible enthusiasm. Don't just conform behaviorally. Conform energetically. Participate enthusiastically in group activities. Volunteer for group initiatives. Signal that you're an engaged believer. This enthusiasm creates such strong conformity signals that your private thinking becomes completely invisible and protected. Fourth technique, choose your battles. Don't conform on everything. Occasionally express mild disagreement on minor issues where disagreement is acceptable. This creates the appearance that you're thinking independently within acceptable bounds. It provides cover for the fact that your real disagreements are much more fundamental but remain completely hidden. Fifth technique, frame private thoughts carefully. When you must express heterodox ideas, frame them as questions rather than assertions. Frame them as exploring implications rather than challenging fundamentals. Frame them as trying to understand rather than disagreeing. This framing allows you to think independently while maintaining the appearance of conforming. Sixth technique, maintain social bonds. Conformity is partly about relationships. Invest in personal relationships with group members. Be personally likable and socially integrated. When you're well-liked and socially connected, people interpret your behavior generously. Your social integration provides another layer of protection for whatever you're thinking privately. These techniques aren't about being fake or hypocritical in a shallow sense. They're about understanding that surviving within systems while maintaining intellectual independence requires managing the signals you send. Your behavior signals conformity, which protects your thinking. Your thinking remains free precisely because your behavior remains conventional. Now let me show you how Law 38 operates in the context of cultural and social norms around sensitive topics. Every society has topics where certain views are socially mandatory regardless of what you privately believe. The people who survive these environments are those who perform the mandatory views behaviorally while maintaining whatever views they actually hold privately. Think about how this operates with any controversial social issue. There are often correct positions you must publicly support to remain socially acceptable. The sophisticated person publicly supports these positions through their behavior and language while privately maintaining whatever views they actually hold. The unsophisticated person either internalizes the mandatory views without thinking or openly challenges them and faces social destruction. This creates interesting dynamics around social change. The mandatory views shift over time. What was mandatory 20 years ago might be unacceptable today. The people who navigated these shifts successfully were usually those who performed current mandatory views while privately maintaining flexibility. They weren't true believers in any particular position. They were strategic conformists who shifted behavioral conformity as social norms shifted. The people who struggled were the ideological purists who refused to shift behavioral conformity even as norms changed. They insisted on publicly maintaining yesterday's mandatory views after they became today's forbidden views. Their behavioral nonconformity destroyed them even though they were actually conforming, just to outdated norms. They failed to understand that Law 38 requires conforming to current norms, not permanent positions. This suggests a sophisticated approach to navigating changing social norms. Maintain behavioral conformity to current norms while keeping your actual thinking flexible and responsive to evidence. Don't internalize mandatory positions so deeply that you can't shift when norms shift. But also don't openly challenge mandatory positions and mark yourself as a nonconformist. The sweet spot is behavioral conformity with intellectual flexibility. Let me take you deeper into the psychological costs of maintaining this division between thinking and behaving, because living according to Law 38 is psychologically demanding. When you consistently think one thing while behaving in ways that contradict your thinking, you create cognitive dissonance. This internal conflict can be exhausting and corrosive if not managed properly. Think about what it means to participate enthusiastically in rituals you find meaningless, to speak language you consider hollow, to support positions you privately disagree with. This requires constant performance, constant monitoring of your behavior to ensure no private thoughts leak through. The psychological effort of maintaining this performance can be substantial, especially over years or decades. Some people handle this easily. They have high tolerance for the disconnect between private thinking and public behavior. They compartmentalize effectively, maintaining separate mental spaces for their real views and their performed views. They don't experience much distress from the contradiction because they've accepted it as necessary for navigating complex social systems. Other people struggle intensely with this division. They experience the performance as a betrayal of their authentic self. They feel they're living a lie, being hypocritical, compromising their integrity. For these people, the psychological cost of Law 38 can be severe, leading to anxiety, depression, or identity confusion. They want to behave authentically even when they understand intellectually that behavioral conformity is strategically necessary. The solution isn't to abandon Law 38, because behavioral nonconformity will destroy you in most contexts. The solution is to develop what I call compartmentalized authenticity. You maintain spaces in your life where you can be completely authentic, where your behavior and thinking fully align, where no performance is necessary. These spaces of authenticity sustain you psychologically while you perform conformity in contexts that demand it. These authentic spaces might be private relationships where you can express your real views. They might be creative outlets where you can explore your actual thinking. They might be anonymous online communities where you can be completely honest. They might be journals where you can articulate what you really think. The specific form doesn't matter. What matters is that you have somewhere you can be authentic, which makes the performance elsewhere bearable. Without these spaces of authenticity, the constant performance becomes psychologically unbearable. You start to lose touch with what you actually think versus what you're performing. You experience identity diffusion where you're not sure who you really are versus who you're pretending to be. You risk psychological breakdown from the sustained cognitive dissonance. But with these spaces of authenticity, you can sustain the performance indefinitely. You know you have a true self that exists in these protected spaces. The performance elsewhere is just that, a performance, not a betrayal of who you actually are. This psychological architecture allows you to master Law 38 without destroying yourself in the process. Now let me show you how Law 38 operates in the context of power accumulation and how strategic conformity enables power building that would be impossible with visible nonconformity. When you're accumulating power, you're by definition changing power structures. This change threatens those currently holding power. If your power accumulation is visible and obviously nonconforming, it will be blocked. But if you conform outwardly while building power privately, you can accumulate substantial power before anyone realizes you're a threat. Think about how people actually rise to power in organizations. The ones who succeed usually appear to be perfect organizational citizens. They follow all the rules. They support leadership publicly. They participate in the culture enthusiastically. They look like ideal conformists. Meanwhile, they're building coalitions, accumulating resources, developing capabilities, positioning themselves strategically. Their behavioral conformity disguises their power accumulation until they've achieved enough power that blocking them becomes difficult. The ones who fail at power accumulation usually signal their ambition too clearly. They openly compete for positions. They visibly challenge current leadership. They behave in ways that make their power-seeking obvious. This triggers defensive responses from those currently holding power, who block the ambitious nonconformist before they can accumulate serious power. The visible nonconformity destroyed their power building before it could succeed. This suggests that power accumulation requires strategic invisibility, which is achieved through behavioral conformity. You must appear to have no personal ambition, to be serving the organization rather than yourself, to be supporting current leadership rather than positioning to replace them. This appearance, created through perfect conformity, is what allows you to actually build power without triggering the defenses that would block you. Once you've accumulated substantial power, you have more freedom to behave nonconformingly because you're now powerful enough to withstand resistance. But that freedom was purchased through years of strategic conformity during the power-building phase. The people who insist on behavioral nonconformity from the beginning never get the power that would make nonconformity sustainable. Let me take you into how Law 38 operates with generational dynamics and how each generation must rediscover this law for themselves. Young people often believe authenticity means behavioral authenticity, that you should behave exactly as you think and feel. This belief leads to visible nonconformity that typically results in harsh consequences. Only after experiencing these consequences do most people learn Law 38 and begin practicing strategic conformity. Think about career progressions. Young professionals often start out being behaviorally authentic. They openly express skepticism about corporate culture. They skip rituals they find meaningless. They dress or speak in ways that signal their independence. They think they're being admirably authentic. Actually, they're marking themselves as cultural threats and limiting their career prospects. After facing consequences, getting passed over for promotions, receiving feedback about cultural fit, most professionals learn to conform behaviorally. They start participating in rituals. They adopt corporate language. They signal cultural alignment. They've learned Law 38 through painful experience. Their career progression typically accelerates once they master behavioral conformity while maintaining intellectual independence. But each generation must learn this individually. The lessons of the previous generation aren't effectively transmitted because they're uncomfortable and seem like compromising integrity. So each generation starts with naive behavioral authenticity, suffers consequences, and gradually learns strategic conformity. The ones who learn fastest tend to advance most quickly. The ones who resist learning longest either remain stuck or get pushed out. This generational pattern suggests that organizations and societies are constantly dealing with a mix of naive nonconformists who haven't learned the law yet and sophisticated conformists who have mastered it. The naive nonconformists think they're being brave and authentic. The sophisticated conformists know they're being strategic and effective. The system gradually converts naive nonconformists into sophisticated conformists through consistent punishment of visible nonconformity. Now let me show you how Law 38 operates differently across different types of social systems and how the required conformity varies by context. In highly authoritarian systems, behavioral conformity must be nearly perfect. Any visible nonconformity can be severely punished. The only safety is complete outward conformity while maintaining whatever thoughts you want completely private. In democratic systems with strong free speech protections, there's more room for behavioral nonconformity in some domains. You can often express heterodox political views without severe consequences. But even in democratic systems, there are domains where behavioral conformity is required: corporate cultures, professional associations, social groups. The difference is that the domains of required conformity are more limited and varied rather than total. In highly traditional societies, conformity to tradition is what's monitored. You must behave according to traditional norms regardless of what you think. In rapidly changing societies, conformity to current trends is what's monitored. You must behave according to contemporary norms regardless of your private thoughts. The content of required conformity changes, but the principle that visible nonconformity gets punished remains constant. Understanding your specific context is crucial for applying Law 38 effectively. You must identify exactly what behaviors are monitored and enforced in your environment. These are the behaviors you must conform to regardless of your private thinking. Meanwhile, there are usually domains where less conformity is required or where your behavior is less visible. These are spaces where you can be more behaviorally authentic without consequences. The sophisticated operator maps their social environment carefully, identifying high conformity requirement domains and low conformity requirement domains. They reserve their limited tolerance for performance for the high requirement domains where conformity is essential. They relax into more authentic behavior in low requirement domains where the costs of nonconformity are manageable. This strategic allocation of conformity effort makes the overall performance sustainable. Let me take you into how Law 38 interacts with moral and ethical questions, because there's a question about whether strategic conformity is ethical or represents a failure of moral courage. The answer depends on what you're conforming to and why you're maintaining the conformity. If you're conforming to evil systems, participating in immoral activities, or enabling harm through your outward conformity, then Law 38 becomes morally problematic. There are situations where visible nonconformity is morally required even though it's strategically costly. The person who conforms outwardly to Nazi Germany while privately disagreeing is complicit and evil regardless of their private thoughts. Some systems shouldn't be conformed to at all. But if you're conforming to merely flawed systems, participating in neutral rituals, or navigating imperfect institutions, then strategic conformity is morally neutral or even positive. Most systems fall into this category. They're not evil, they're just imperfect. Strategic conformity allows you to work within these systems while maintaining intellectual independence and gradually improving them. This is morally acceptable and often optimal. The distinction is crucial. Law 38 is a strategy for navigating social systems, not an absolute moral principle. You must make ethical judgments about which systems deserve conformity and which don't. The law tells you how to survive within systems through strategic conformity. Ethics tells you which systems are worth surviving within and which should be openly resisted even at personal cost. This suggests a framework: evaluate the system you're operating in. If it's fundamentally evil or causing serious harm, visible nonconformity and exit might be morally required despite the personal costs. If it's merely imperfect or frustrating but not evil, strategic conformity while working for improvement is usually the most effective approach. If it's generally good but has aspects you disagree with, conformity on most things while selective nonconformity on crucial issues might be optimal. The error is treating Law 38 as an absolute rather than a context-dependent strategy. Some contexts require conformity for effectiveness. Some contexts require nonconformity for morality. Most contexts allow for strategic conformity that's both effective and ethical. The art is distinguishing which situation you're in and responding appropriately. Now let me show you how Law 38 operates in the context of social change and reform movements. The reformers who succeed are usually those who maintain enough conformity to existing systems that they're taken seriously while pushing for change. The reformers who fail are usually those who reject existing systems entirely and behave so nonconformingly that they're dismissed as radicals. Think about successful reform movements. They typically work within existing institutional frameworks. They use conventional language and methods. They frame their reforms as restoring original principles or fulfilling system promises rather than overthrowing the system. This behavioral conformity to system norms is what allows their reforms to be considered seriously rather than rejected automatically. The civil rights movement in America succeeded partly because its leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. understood Law 38 perfectly. They framed their demands as fulfilling American constitutional promises. They used religious language familiar to the culture. They maintained respectful nonviolent protest methods. This behavioral conformity to American values and norms made their message palatable to enough people to create change. Compare this to more radical movements that openly rejected American systems and values, that behaved in ways that violated cultural norms, that used rhetoric that sounded foreign or threatening. These movements might have been equally morally justified, but their behavioral nonconformity prevented them from building the coalitions necessary for change. Their failure wasn't in their thinking but in their behavior. This suggests that effective reform requires understanding what the system will tolerate behaviorally. You must push the boundaries of acceptable thought while staying within the boundaries of acceptable behavior. This balance allows you to shift thinking without triggering the defensive responses that block change. You're changing minds while conforming to the behavioral norms that make mind changing possible. The revolutionary who wants to overthrow everything often accomplishes nothing because their total nonconformity unites everyone against them. The reformer who wants to improve specific things while maintaining system legitimacy often accomplishes substantial change because their behavioral conformity makes their reforms acceptable. The difference is understanding Law 38 and applying it strategically. Let me take you into the relationship between Law 38 and authenticity movements that emphasize being your true self. These movements often reject strategic conformity as inauthentic or as compromising integrity. They advocate for behavioral authenticity, for expressing your real self regardless of social expectations. This advice sounds empowering but is often practically disastrous. Think about what happens when people follow advice to just be themselves without strategic conformity. They express opinions that offend. They behave in ways that violate norms. They dress, speak, and act according to their preferences without considering social context. They think they're being admirably authentic. Actually, they're making themselves unemployable, unmarketable, and socially marginal. The harsh reality is that most contexts require substantial conformity for success. The person who insists on complete behavioral authenticity will fail in most careers, struggle in most social contexts, and remain perpetually frustrated that the world doesn't accept them as they are. Their authenticity, while personally satisfying, is professionally and socially costly. The sophisticated approach is selective authenticity. You identify contexts where authenticity is safe and valued, and you're fully authentic there. You identify contexts where conformity is required, and you conform strategically there. You don't try to be authentic everywhere. You choose where authenticity serves you and where conformity serves you. This selective authenticity isn't selling out or being fake. It's understanding that different contexts have different requirements. You can be completely authentic with close friends while being professionally conforming at work. You can express your real aesthetic preferences in your home while conforming to dress codes at the office. You're still authentically you, just strategically deployed across contexts that have different tolerance for nonconformity. The person who masters this selective authenticity typically ends up happier and more successful than the person who insists on universal authenticity. They have spaces where they can be completely real, which satisfies their need for authentic expression. They have spaces where they conform strategically, which allows them to succeed professionally and socially. The division between these spaces is what makes both possible. Now let me show you one extended final case study that demonstrates Law 38 at master level across multiple dimensions. In the mid-20th century, a man named John Nash was developing revolutionary mathematics that would eventually win him the Nobel Prize. But he was also developing schizophrenia, which caused him to have bizarre beliefs and occasionally strange behavior. Nash understood, during his clearer periods, that his professional survival depended on behavioral conformity despite his internal mental chaos. He learned to hide his delusions, to behave conventionally in professional contexts, to maintain the appearance of normalcy even when his thinking was profoundly disordered. This strategic conformity allowed him to maintain his position at Princeton and continue his mathematical work. During periods when his conformity broke down, when his mental illness produced visible nonconforming behavior, he faced severe consequences. He was hospitalized, lost positions, was marginalized professionally. But when he learned to maintain behavioral conformity again, he was able to return to professional life. His career trajectory perfectly demonstrated Law 38, think whatever your mind produces, but behave as others expect. What makes this case study powerful is that Nash wasn't just hiding intellectual nonconformity. He was hiding profound mental illness that produced beliefs most people would consider insane. Yet by maintaining behavioral conformity, by learning to act normal even when his thinking was far from normal, he was able to sustain a career and eventually achieve recognition for his earlier work. This demonstrates the ultimate power of Law 38. It's not about the content of your thinking at all. It's purely about behavior. You can think anything, believe anything, experience anything internally. As long as your behavior remains conventional and socially acceptable, you can function within society and achieve your goals. The moment your internal experience produces visibly nonconforming behavior, you face consequences regardless of whether your thinking is brilliant, insane, or anywhere in between. This also demonstrates the limits of Law 38. Nash's strategic conformity worked during periods when he could maintain behavioral control. But severe mental illness eventually overcomes the ability to perform conformity. For most people, the challenge is much easier because they're just managing intellectual nonconformity rather than clinical delusions. If Nash could do it with schizophrenia, you can certainly do it with mere heterodox opinions about corporate culture or political systems. So as we close this exploration of Law 38, understand that this law is about the fundamental division between thinking and behaving that all sophisticated people must master. You cannot survive in complex social systems while insisting on behavioral authenticity that matches your thinking authenticity. The systems will destroy you. Not because they're evil but because all social systems require behavioral conformity to function. You must learn to perform conformity while thinking independently. This isn't betraying yourself. It's understanding how social systems actually work and navigating them effectively. Your private thoughts remain completely free precisely because your public behavior remains completely conventional. The conformity purchases the independence. Think as you like but behave like others. Not because you're weak or fake, but because you're strategic and sophisticated. Not because you lack integrity, but because you understand that intellectual integrity and behavioral conformity are separate domains that can coexist. Not because you're selling out, but because you're ensuring you survive and thrive within systems long enough to potentially change them or outlive them. The naive person insists on behavioral authenticity and gets destroyed. The sophisticated person performs behavioral conformity and maintains freedom. The master performs conformity so perfectly that no one ever suspects the heterodoxy of their private thinking. This mastery is what allows intellectual independence within social systems designed to enforce conformity. This is Law 38. This is how you think freely while surviving in societies that demand obedience. That's everything.